The first shows that I worked was down here, man, around Houston.
No one expected a stack of old, fading documents to shake the mythology of Elvis Presley. Yet that's exactly what happened when a set of long-forgotten jet logs surfaced. Records from the Lisa Marie, Elvis's beloved private jet. They weren't meant to be found. Buried in an estate box mislabeled years ago, they were almost thrown out with other routine paperwork. But when someone noticed the handwritten notes in the margins, the flight numbers, the signatures, everything stopped. These weren't ordinary logs. They were Elvis's movements, documented, time-stamped, and quietly revealing a side of him fans never imagined. The first reaction was disbelief. Elvis's final decade had been chronicled endlessly, or so everyone thought. Every performance, every public appearance, every rumor had been analyzed, debated, retold. But these logs contradicted pieces of the story that had stood unchallenged for decades. They showed late-night departures when Elvis was supposedly resting at Graceland, mysterious landings at small airports nobody could explain, and a repeated pattern of destinations that didn't match any tour schedule, film commitment, or public record. The team of archivists went silent as they flipped through the pages. Each new entry added another layer of intrigue. Elvis hadn't just traveled more than people knew, he'd traveled with purpose. The logs showed flights with only 2 or 3 passengers, flights with no listed crew besides the pilot, and destinations so obscure they seemed almost intentionally hidden. Some trips lasted only a few hours. Others spanned days with no public explanation for where he'd gone or why he'd gone there. For fans, Elvis's jet had always symbolized freedom and glamour, a symbol of the king living large. But these logs painted a different picture. This wasn't a man casually hopping from city to city for fun. It was a man searching, escaping, moving toward something he couldn't find at home. And the deeper the archivists looked, the clearer it became. The jet wasn't just transportation, it was sanctuary. One of the earliest entries that raised eyebrows occurred during a week when Elvis was believed to be secluded at Graceland, recovering from exhaustion. According to the official narrative, he barely left his room. Yet the log showed a flight that took off after midnight, returned just before sunrise, and listed only one passenger, E.A. Presley. No entourage, no friends, no security detail. Whoever he met, wherever he went, he made that journey alone. That discovery shifted everything. If Elvis was making quiet, secretive flights, then what else about his life had gone unrecorded or misunderstood? Why did he feel the need to leave in the middle of the night? Who was he avoiding? Or who was he trying to reach without anyone knowing? The next set of entries deepened the mystery. Multiple flights were directed to the same small, unnamed regional airfield, one so out of the way that few commercial planes ever used it. The name meant nothing to the archivists, and for a moment, they assumed it was a refueling stop. But the timestamps proved otherwise. Elvis spent hours there, sometimes entire nights, sometimes multiple visits within the same month. And each time, the logs included a small handwritten checkmark beside the destination, as if someone wanted to track those specific trips separately. That's when speculation began to change into something heavier. These weren't accidental layovers. These were intentional, repeated journeys to a place he didn't want recorded in any public itinerary. And the fact that no one had ever mentioned this location, not pilots, not staff, not anyone in Elvis's orbit, suggested that whatever happened there was meant to remain silent. The emotional weight of this started to settle in. For years, the story of Elvis's later life focused on isolation, pressure, fatigue, and the struggle to maintain control. But the logs hinted at something far more complex. They showed a man who wasn't surrendering to his circumstances. He was fighting them, quietly, privately, and on his own terms. The Lisa Marie became his way out, his way forward, his way of carving space for himself in a world that refused to leave him alone. One entry, dated just months before his passing, carried a note written in someone's hurried handwriting. Urgent. Must depart tonight. No explanation, no reason, and once again, the destination was that same obscure airfield. Whatever drew Elvis there, whatever waited for him, it was important enough to override everything else happening in his life. As archivists pieced together timelines and cross-referenced travel logs with known events, they noticed another pattern. The jet flights often corresponded with moments of intense pressure in Elvis's career. Difficult business meetings, public controversies, severe bouts of exhaustion. In the official narratives, Elvis stayed home to rest. But the logs told a different truth. He left. He flew out to places no one documented. He disappeared into nights that no biography had ever captured. And looming over all these discoveries was the biggest question of all. Why did Elvis keep returning to one specific destination? And why had no one ever mentioned it? The archivists agreed on one thing. Whatever story these logs were revealing, it was far bigger than a series of flights. It was the story of a man the world thought they understood, but never truly knew. The deeper investigators went into the jet logs, the clearer it became that these weren't casual trips taken on a whim. They reflected deliberate choices. Times when Elvis slipped away from the pressures surrounding him and sought something only he could name. Each entry told a different story, but together they painted a portrait of a man fighting for pieces of himself the world never saw. The first wave of destinations raised immediate questions. Some were small medical facilities positioned far from prying eyes, places where a superstar could walk in without flashbulbs or reporters crouching behind parked cars. The logs indicated late-night arrivals, short stays, and departures before dawn. These weren't the glamorous clinics people imagined celebrities using. They were modest, tucked-away places designed to offer privacy before comfort. It suggested that even when Elvis needed help, he wanted to receive it without spectacle. He didn't want the public to know how deeply the pressures weighed on him, and he didn't want his inner circle to turn his struggles into negotiations or plans. Other flights landed at spiritual retreats, remote cabins, ranch-style lodges, and quiet mountain facilities bearing names few fans would recognize. The log showed he visited some of these places just once, others several times. The purpose seemed clear. Elvis wasn't looking for publicity. He was looking for peace. Those who traveled with him described moments when he would step off the jet, inhale the cold morning air, and stand in silence, as though trying to reconnect with the version of himself that existed before fame swallowed everything. The discovery reframed everything. These weren't flights of escape. They were flights toward home, or at least toward the closest thing he had left to it. The estate sat on open land where no reporters circled, no crowds gathered, no deals hovered over him. It offered something priceless, the chance to exist without expectation. People who lived in the sparse communities nearby remembered seeing Elvis there only once or twice. But those who knew the estate's owner recalled many more visits, quiet ones, unannounced ones, late-night ones when the jet's roar blended with the wind and vanished before anyone realized who had arrived. The logs showed that these visits increased during the most turbulent moments of Elvis's final years. After tense negotiations, after medical scares, after conflicts within his inner circle. Each moment of strain sent him back to that unremarkable strip of concrete in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't glamour pulling him there. It was the need for a space untouched by fame. A place where he didn't have to perform strength he no longer felt. Crew members who flew with him described those flights differently from the others. Elvis was quiet in a way that didn't signal bitterness, but reflection. He would sit by the window and watch the dark fields glide by below, his face softening as though the weight he carried loosened with every mile. Sometimes he talked about music he still wanted to record, about regrets he never voiced publicly, about dreams he feared would never materialize. Other times he simply closed his eyes and breathed, as if the time in the air gave him more peace than any room in Graceland could. When investigators cross-checked the logs with known events, a striking detail emerged. One of Elvis's most deeply troubled periods, aligned with a cluster of back-to-back flights to the estate. These were the weeks when rumors of exhaustion and declining health began growing louder. Rumors the public dismissed or misinterpreted. But the logs revealed that Elvis wasn't withdrawing into isolation. He was seeking a refuge far from the noise of his life. The most haunting entry, however, came near the bottom of the logbook, a flight dated just days before Elvis's death. The jet left Memphis late in the evening and returned shortly before dawn. The same destination, the same quiet secrecy. No one on record ever mentioned this final trip, not friends, not staff, not pilots. The passenger list was left blank, but fuel logs and timestamps confirmed the jet's journey. Whatever happened on that land during those few hours remains locked in silence. Some believe Elvis went there to make peace with someone important. Others think he was preparing to change his life, perhaps stepping away from Graceland, perhaps planning a break the world never learned of, and some believe he simply needed one last moment of clarity before facing the pressures he knew would never stop pressing in around him. Whatever the truth, the logs make one thing undeniable. Elvis wasn't running away from himself. He was searching for the one place where the man he used to be still existed. And that final mysterious flight, unrecorded, unmentioned, unexplained, has become the key to understanding everything that followed. When investigators reached the final entries in the jet logs, the pages felt heavier than the ones before them. They weren't simply documenting where Elvis had gone. They were documenting what remained of a man trying to hold on to pieces of himself in a life that no longer felt like his own. The last recorded flights weren't marked by glamour or excitement. They carried the quiet ache of someone moving through the world with intention, searching for meaning in places untouched by fame. The logs showed that as Elvis's health began slipping, his private flights became less frequent but more emotionally charged. Each trip had a sense of urgency, as though he knew time was narrowing and he needed moments of clarity before he couldn't seek them anymore. The destinations were familiar, places that had comforted him before. The quiet estate, the remote retreat, the small airstrip where he could step off the jet without being recognized or celebrated. These were not the choices of a star trying to dazzle the world. They were the choices of a man trying to remember who he had been before the crown took hold. Crew members later said the atmosphere during those flights felt different. Elvis wasn't restless in the way he'd been years prior. He wasn't pacing aisles or overflowing with ideas for new songs. He was calm, reflective, and strangely at peace during the hours they spent in the air. He would sit quietly with a blanket draped over his lap, speaking only when something important tugged at him. Sometimes he'd ask a question out of nowhere, as if revisiting old decisions and wondering how they had shaped his life. Other times he'd smile faintly, as though recalling memories from long before the world took him. One pilot remembered Elvis saying, "Up here, nobody expects anything from me." It wasn't said with bitterness. It was said with relief. The jet had become the only place where he wasn't being pulled, directed, or packaged into something the world needed him to be. It was a moving sanctuary, a space between responsibilities. And in those final months, Elvis clung to that space whenever he could. The final flight entry was both ordinary and devastating. There was no dramatic notation, no hint of impending tragedy, just a timestamp, a signature, and the same mysterious destination he had visited countless times. The jet departed Memphis under a quiet sky and returned hours later. No passengers were listed, no comments were added, but the timing of the flight, so close to the end, raised questions that linger even now. Why did Elvis feel compelled to go back there one last time? Was he confiding in someone? Was he finding closure? Was he making plans he never got to pursue? Or was he simply trying to breathe freely one final time before returning to a world that had grown too heavy? What investigators pieced together from those final days suggests a heartbreaking truth. Elvis wasn't trying to flee his life. He was trying to reclaim it. He hadn't given up. He hadn't resigned himself to isolation. In his own quiet way, he was still reaching for hope, still seeking moments that reminded him he was more than the legend he'd become. And perhaps that's why the jet logs matter so deeply. They don't expose scandal or reveal dramatic secrets. They reveal intention. They show a man who, despite everything, refused to disappear into the machinery of fame. A man who used whatever freedom he had left to carve out pockets of peace. A man who kept returning to a place where he could stand on open ground without the weight of expectation pressing into his shoulders. For fans, the logs reshape the narrative of Elvis's final years. They show that he wasn't drifting aimlessly. He wasn't lost in the haze of his own legend. He was searching, deliberately, quietly, searching for connection, for meaning, for pieces of himself the world had forgotten to see. His final flight wasn't an escape. It was a return, a journey toward the only place where the legend fell away and the man could finally breathe. And now, decades later, the logs stand as one of the most intimate windows into his truth. Not the myth, not the icon. The human being who carried both brilliance and burden with the same fragile hands. If these uncovered jet logs changed how you see Elvis, share your thoughts below. Which destination surprised you most? And what do you think he was searching for on that final flight? Subscribe for more powerful, untold stories hidden behind the world's biggest legends. Top of form, bottom of form.